It's strange how silence can feel heavier than noise. When the smoke cleared, and I stood barefoot in the wet ashes where my living room used to be, I thought the worst part would be the loss. The smell of charred wood. The way the moonlight caught on the jagged skeleton of my roof. But no, the worst part was knowing exactly who had done it, and realizing she'd be walking into my courtroom in 7 days. That night wasn't the beginning. It was the culmination of months, years, really, of skirmishes that started small and metastasized into something I still can't believe happened in a quiet, suburban neighborhood. My name is Miles Hamilton. I'm a municipal judge in Oakwood County, and until recently, I believed in the idea that the law, patient, deliberate, stubbornly procedural, was the best shield against people like Karen Whitmore. Karen, the president of our HOA for 3 unbroken years, wielded her position like a badge and a weapon rolled into one. She could weaponize a rule faster than some people could reload a sentence, and she lived for making an example out of anyone who didn't conform to her version of neighborhood harmony. The irony is, I didn't move here to stir trouble. I moved into 1247, Maple Lane because it was my grandfather's house, my family's legacy. I'd barely unpacked before Karen made it her mission to vet me, as if my very presence was a violation. At first, it was laughable. Emails reminding me of lawn height regulations. Notes taped to my door accusing me of parking commercial vehicles, by which she meant my 10-year-old Honda Accord. And of course, the carefully worded neighborhood-wide messages about unknown young individuals who might be living here without authorization. It was petty, exhausting, and relentless. But I knew how to handle petty. Or so I thought. Then, about 8 months in, something changed. Karen stopped pretending it was about rules. She began telling neighbors I was a fraud, that my law career was built on loopholes, and that she'd find something real to take me down. The smiles at the mailbox stopped. The nods from across the street turned into drawn curtains. Still, I didn't break. I collected evidence, dozens of instances of selective rule enforcement, HOA funds misused for personal expenses, even records of fake amendments she'd slid into the bylaws without a vote. I told myself the law would win in the end. But on the night of the fire, there was no law, just the hiss of flames, the roar of adrenaline, and the gut-deep knowledge that this wasn't just arson. It was personal. The strangest thing? I wasn't surprised. I'd seen the escalation coming, like a slow-motion train wreck. I just underestimated how far she was willing to go. And in 7 days, she'd walk into my courtroom, certain she still held the upper hand. The thing about fire is, it's greedy. It doesn't care about history, about the way my grandfather's hands had planed the cedar beams in the living room, or how the window frames still smelled faintly of the lemon oil my grandmother used every Sunday. Fire devours indiscriminately. But people? People burn selectively. The investigation later confirmed what I already knew that night. The blaze started on the side of the house facing the street, far from the kitchen, far from anything electrical. It began in a patch of shrubs no one had touched in months, except Karen. I'd seen her there 2 days before, crouched by the bushes under the pretense of checking for compliance with seasonal landscaping ordinances. She'd smiled when she caught me watching, like a cat caught mid-pounce but entirely unashamed. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The fire was the crescendo, but Karen had been turning up the heat for months. It started with what I called paper cuts, tiny, constant jabs meant to bleed patients dry. Fake citations for non-existent violations. Photos of my driveway emailed to the HOA listserv with captions like, potential security risk. A demand that I replace my front porch light because it was too bright for the neighborhood's ambience. Each time, I'd respond with the same calm professionalism I used on the bench. Dear Ms. Whitmore, please provide the specific bylaw that, but Karen never sent bylaws, she sent threats disguised as neighborly concern. Then, late one Thursday night, I got a call from my bank's fraud department. Someone had attempted to open 3 credit cards in my name. The applications used my real address, but the email contact belonged to someone else, an address I recognized. It was the same one Karen had once used in a mass HOA reminder about proper mailbox labeling. Coincidence? Not when the applications were submitted minutes apart from my Wi-Fi being mysteriously disconnected. I filed a report, logged the evidence, and started locking things down harder: multi-factor authentication, physical document storage, even motion sensors along the property's perimeter. My friends called it paranoia. I called it survival. 2 weeks later, a box arrived on my porch. No return address. Inside, a tangle of cheap jewelry, a half-used bottle of prescription pills with someone else's name on it, and, most chilling of all, a flash drive. The drive contained exactly one file: photos of my house, all taken from the inside. The angles weren't from windows, they were from someone standing in my living room. My office. My bedroom. In one shot, my gavel, the one I kept from my first swearing-in, sat on my desk, a sticky note stuck to its handle with the words, "Not so untouchable now, Judge." The police called it disturbing, but inconclusive. There were no prints. No camera timestamps. And the pills? Probably planted junk. Their advice: install more cameras, keep the doors locked. As if I hadn't already been living in a fortress. The fire came less than a month after that. I'd fallen asleep on the couch, legal briefs scattered around me, when the smell hit: sharp, chemical, not the earthy smoke of a fireplace but the acrid sting of accelerant. By the time I made it to the door, the shrubs were already a wall of flame. Heat licked at the siding. Somewhere beyond the roar, I could hear neighbors shouting, phones dialing 911. Through the blur of heat and panic, I caught a silhouette under the streetlight across the way. Short hair. Tall posture. Clipboard in hand. She didn't run. She just stood there until the sirens grew loud, then turned and walked back toward her porch like she'd merely been out for fresh air. The fire department did their job. My house wasn't reduced to cinders, but the damage was surgical, just enough to gut the living room, scorch the office, and make the place uninhabitable for months. The official cause? Suspicious origin. No suspects named. And then, 7 days later, Karen Whitmore walked into my courtroom. Not as a defendant, but as the plaintiff in a civil case against a neighbor who challenged her authority over shared property use. She didn't even flinch when she saw me on the bench. If anything, her lips twitched into the faintest smirk, as if she'd already won, as if the fire had been just another strategic move in a long game she believed I couldn't touch. That was her mistake. Because by then, I wasn't just a judge. I was a man with nothing left to lose, and more evidence than she could imagine. Karen had always been bold. Brazen enough to stroll into my courtroom a week after my living room went up in flames, posture straight, eyes locked on mine like this was some kind of power play. But here's the thing about power plays: they only work when the other side doesn't see the board. And I'd been quietly rearranging the pieces for months. It started with the HOA records. When my grandfather founded Oakwood Estates in the early 80s, he insisted on a clause that the founding family would always have access to certain HOA records for historical archiving. Karen clearly never noticed that little footnote in the bylaws. I used it to get everything: meeting transcripts, financial statements, incident logs. I didn't just find inconsistencies, I found patterns. Fines issued in clusters, always targeting the same people: newer homeowners, single residents, retirees with no family nearby. Emergency landscaping, contracts awarded to a company owned by Karen's cousin, paid double the going rate. A security patrol service that billed the HOA every month but hadn't actually patrolled in over a year. And buried in the expense reports, a $9,750 community improvement fund withdrawal in cash, 2 weeks before my fire. I didn't take it to the HOA board, they were the problem. Instead, I called in a favor from an old colleague, Agent Ramirez, now working in financial crimes. I didn't tell him about the fire yet. Just the paper trail. He told me, "This looks bad, but if you want a real case, you're going to need more than bad. That's when I decided to bait Karen. 2 nights later, I left my office lights on past midnight and pulled my car out of the driveway, making it look like I'd gone out. In reality, I parked down the block and walked back on foot. I wanted to see if Karen, or one of her little enforcement deputies, would take the bait. It didn't take long. At 12:47 a.m., a shadow moved across my lawn. A tall man in a dark jacket, hoodie pulled tight. He didn't even glance at the cameras, because he was holding a small handheld device I recognized instantly, a signal jammer. He disabled my exterior feeds in seconds, then tried the back door. Locked. He moved to the office window. That's when I stepped out from the corner, flashlight beam catching his face. It wasn't some random HOA volunteer. It was Brad Jenkins, a security consultant Karen had hired 6 months earlier. And I knew for a fact Brad's consulting license had been revoked 2 years ago for theft from a client's home. He froze when he saw me, then bolted. I didn't chase him, not physically. I didn't need to. My hidden cameras inside the house weren't on the same system he'd jammed. They caught his face in perfect HD. By sunrise, that footage was in Ramirez's inbox. But Karen, she still thought she was untouchable. The next HOA meeting was her stage, and she played it like a queen holding court. She announced a new community compliance task force to crack down on non-participating members. She didn't name me, but her eyes did. The room chuckled along nervously, the way people do when they want to be on the safe side of a tyrant. That's when I decided to move beyond just defending myself. I was going to dismantle the entire machine. Step 1, follow the money. Step 2, follow the fear. Fear led me to an elderly neighbor, Mrs. Torres, who'd been slapped with $3,500 in fines for failing to maintain her lawn, while she was in the hospital for knee surgery. She whispered to me in her kitchen, eyes darting to the curtains, "If I fight them, they'll make it worse. They always do." Money led me to a man named Victor Hollis, owner of a landscaping company that, according to county records, had billed Oakwood Estates for over $200,000 in the past year. Victor lived 3 towns over, in a house registered to a shell corporation. And that corporation? It had ties to 2 more HOAs in neighboring counties, both of which had presidents with Whitmore in their contact logs. It wasn't just petty fines anymore. It was organized skimming, layered through bogus contracts and fake enforcement jobs. And the arson at my place? That was just the muscle. The intimidation tactic. The game had changed. This wasn't about one Karen drunk on HOA power. This was a small-time criminal empire hiding behind manicured lawns and community spirit. In court the next week, she still smiled when I entered. But I could see it, the faintest flicker of something behind her eyes. Because by then, I wasn't just the guy she'd been harassing for months. I was the one holding threads connected to everything she'd built. And I was starting to pull. Karen had that same smug smile plastered on her face when she strode into my courtroom for the second time in as many weeks. The fire hadn't rattled her. Brad Jenkins' midnight visit hadn't slowed her. If anything, she seemed more certain that I was cornered. That was good. Overconfidence is a crack in the armor, and I'd been sharpening my chisel. I'd spent the last 7 days turning my home office into a war room. Every wall was covered in printouts, bank records, HOA meeting minutes, photographs of Karen's so-called security team making late-night visits to homes they had no business near. A whiteboard in the center listed names, arrows, and dollar figures like a detective's dream, or a prosecutor's. The hardest part hadn't been finding dirt on Karen. The hardest part was doing it quietly, without alerting her network. And make no mistake, she had a network. At first glance, Oakwood Estates was just another HOA, a handful of bored retirees, some self-important middle managers, the usual crowd. But once I dug deeper, patterns emerged. Victor Hollis, the landscaper who'd billed $200,000 to Oakwood this year, was also billing 2 other HOAs across county lines. His work crews included Brad Jenkins and 3 other men with revoked security licenses. Shirley Phelps, the HOA treasurer, had a personal checking account that received reimbursements from the HOA, often on the same day she made large cash withdrawals. Karen Whitmore herself had taken travel allowances for regional HOA conferences that didn't exist. When I cross-referenced the dates, she'd been in Las Vegas during one and on a Caribbean cruise during another. Every dollar skimmed was wrapped in enough legitimate-looking paperwork to bore an auditor into missing it. It was slick. Too slick for one petty tyrant to have designed alone. The next move had to be deliberate. I couldn't just throw the whole file at the county DA, not yet. If I moved too soon, Karen would close ranks, destroy evidence, maybe even disappear behind some legal smokescreen. I needed her to make a mistake in public, in a way that tied her directly to the worst of it. That's when I remembered the Community Compliance Task Force she'd announced at the last meeting. It was nothing more than a gang of her enforcers with clipboards, but she'd dressed it up as a public safety initiative. And, most importantly, she'd funded it with HOA money under the Emergency Security Clause. If I could get her to deploy that task force somewhere she shouldn't, with money she shouldn't be spending, I could tie her actions directly to financial misuse and harassment. So I set the bait. I drafted an anonymous tip email to the HOA's general inbox, complete with grainy, night vision-style photos of my garage door ajar and a blurred silhouette slipping inside. The silhouette was me, wearing a hoodie and moving just enough to make the footage grainy. The text claimed suspicious activity at my property and urged urgent HOA intervention. The next morning, at precisely 10:13 a.m., Karen forwarded the email to her inner circle. I know this because one of those inner circle members, Mrs. Torres, the elderly neighbor they'd fined into submission, had agreed to BCC me on anything she got. By 10:45, Brad Jenkins' black SUV was parked outside my house. By 11 o'clock, he and another man I didn't recognize were inspecting my backyard gate. They didn't knock. They didn't call. They just started poking around. I let them work for exactly 7 minutes before stepping outside with my phone recording. "Gentlemen," I called out, "do you have a warrant?" They froze. The new guy glanced at Brad like he'd just been told the ground was lava. Brad cleared his throat. "We're here on behalf of the HOA for a security check." I smiled. "That's interesting. Because my property isn't common ground, and there's no clause in the bylaws giving you access without permission. Which I haven't given." Brad tried again. "Karen authorized." "Perfect," I said, still recording. "Could you repeat that last part?" He clamped his mouth shut. I walked them to the curb, politely, professionally, and then sent the footage to Agent Ramirez. 2 hours later, Ramirez texted me, "That's misuse of HOA funds for unauthorized private security. Keep going." The next HOA meeting was packed, more neighbors than I'd seen in months. Karen sat at the head of the table, perfectly composed, flipping through her notes. I waited until she'd finished her opening spiel about security concerns, before standing up. "I have a question," I said, projecting my voice just enough. "How much did the HOA spend last month on the Community Compliance Task Force?" Karen gave me that condescending tilt of the head. "All expenses are in the monthly report." "Really?" I held up a printout. "Because according to the report, $6,432 was spent on urgent security interventions. Care to explain why 2 men, one of whom has a revoked security license, were caught on my property during one of these interventions?" A murmur rolled through the room. Karen's eyes narrowed. "We act on tips to keep this neighborhood safe." I stepped forward. "Funny thing about that tip, it was fake. I sent it. Which means you authorized spending HOA money on a private security operation against a resident, without cause, on private property." The room went silent. Karen's lips moved, but no sound came out. I didn't need her to answer. Every second she sat there, every flicker of panic in her eyes, was another thread I could pull later in front of a much bigger audience. That was the first time I saw it, the crack. Not the fiery temper she used to intimidate people, not the smug control. This was different. This was calculation, interrupted. She knew now that I wasn't just resisting. I was building a case. And the kind of case that doesn't end in a fine or a resignation. It ends in a raid. The morning it happened, Oakwood Estates looked like every realtor's dream. Freshly mowed lawns. Sprinklers ticking in perfect arcs. Neighbors in pastel jogging gear waving half-heartedly at one another. It was the kind of surface-level calm that had allowed Karen's little empire to thrive for so long. By noon, it would look like the set of a crime drama. Agent Ramirez had been careful, meticulous. He hadn't rushed the investigation, he'd expanded it. The footage of Brad Jenkins on my property had been the perfect entry point. From there, they subpoenaed HOA financial records, records I'd already copied, but now they had them directly from the source. They didn't just find misuse of funds, they found fraud, wire transfers to shell companies, and even a connection to an interstate theft ring that explained why certain security inspections had coincided with missing property reports in 3 different neighborhoods. The accelerant used in my fire? Same chemical signature as a string of mysterious garage fires in 2 other HOA-controlled communities. Those fires had been followed by quick insurance payouts handled by the same preferred claims consultant who'd attended Karen's Christmas parties. It wasn't petty anymore. It was RICO-level crime hiding behind potluck BBQs and landscaping committees. The warrant came down at 6:48 a.m. on a Tuesday. By 7:15, unmarked SUVs were parked along the curb outside the HOA clubhouse. I was there, not as a judge this time, but as the complainant who'd lit the fuse. Ramirez stood beside me, calm as ever. "You don't have to be here for this," he said. "I've waited a long time to see this," I replied. The clubhouse doors blew open in less than 30 seconds. 2 marshals went in first, shouting commands, their boots thudding against the polished laminate floor. A third held the door as agents in navy jackets streamed inside. The muffled sounds of drawers slamming, papers shuffling, and Karen's raised voice spilled out. When they brought her into view, she wasn't in her pastel power suit. She was in jeans and a sweatshirt, hair pulled back, eyes flashing, not with confidence this time, but with something between disbelief and fury. "Judge Hamilton," she spat when she saw me. "You think this is over? You think?" I didn't respond. I didn't have to. Ramirez read her the charges: fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy, arson, attempted insurance fraud, harassment, and obstruction. The list took nearly a full minute. She tried to speak over him, but one of the marshals gently guided her toward the waiting SUV. Inside the clubhouse, it was chaos, laptops bagged and tagged, filing cabinets hauled onto dollies, boxes of paper sealed with evidence tape. On one corkboard, still pinned neatly among the HOA's meeting schedules, was a copy of my violation notice from months ago, the one claiming my lawn was too long. Karen had circled my address in red ink. In the treasurer's office, agents found a locked drawer containing multiple passports, credit cards in other people's names, and a thick envelope of cash. I recognized one of the names from the flash drive photos, the prescription pill bottle in that planted box on my porch. By 9:30, the clubhouse was empty except for me, Ramirez, and one other agent who was photographing the meeting table. The room felt smaller without Karen holding court at the head. "You know," Ramirez said, "if this had been just about HOA bullying, it probably would have ended with a fine and a slap on the wrist." I nodded. "She made it about more than that." "You made it about more than that," he corrected. The case made headlines by that afternoon. Local HOA president arrested in federal fraud sting wasn't the kind of news Oakwood's marketing brochures could spin away. Property values dipped overnight, but for the first time since I'd moved in, I saw neighbors smiling for real, relieved smiles, the kind you get when the pressure finally lifts. Karen took a plea deal months later. Brad Jenkins and Victor Hollis weren't so lucky, their charges stacked high enough to ensure long sentences. The fire at my home was part of the official record, tied directly to an intimidation plot meant to push me out and make an example of me. I rebuilt. Not just the living room, but the entire house. The scorched cedar beams were replaced with fresh ones, but I kept one charred fragment on my desk as a reminder. Not of Karen, but of the moment I decided to stop just enduring and start dismantling. The HOA still exists, technically. But it's no longer a weapon. The bylaws were rewritten under court supervision, with safeguards that make it almost impossible for another, Karen Whitmore, to rise to power unchecked. Sometimes, when I drive past the old clubhouse, I catch myself smiling. Not because of the fall of one woman, but because of the crack in the armor she thought was impenetrable. Because in the end, the thing that brought her down wasn't just the evidence, it was her own belief that she could never be caught. Fire consumes indiscriminately. But justice? Justice burns exactly where it needs to.